So last section we saw the effect the Europeans had on Africa, which was largely negative because of the growth of the slave trade, because they needed the slaves to work the sugarcane plantations in the New World, particularly in the Caribbean along the coast of Brazil and eventually the American South as well. Now we're going to look at what was going on in Southeast Asia during the same time period, this age of exploration. Now, before the Europeans ever showed up, there were strong mainland states in Southeast Asia, like Thailand, Burma, and Vietnam. Mainland means exactly what it sounds like. It's not the islands. It's on the mainland of Southeast Asia. These were strong, very well ran, highly sophisticated kingdoms that could fend off the advances of first Islamic traders and conquerors, and then later on Europeans. So for the 14 and 15 into the 1600s, mainland Southeast Asia is going to remain independent from European control. Now later on in the school year, you get to the late 16 and into the 17, 1800s, that's going to be different. But for now, they can fend people off. Now, along the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian archipelago, which is just a fancy word for chain of islands, you see the growth of Islam. Islam, of course, was created in the Middle East. You learned that last year. Then it spreads to Central Asia. Then it spreads to India, and from India to the islands of Southeast Asia, until eventually many throughout Southeast Asia began to convert to Islam, and eventually even Islamic kingdoms are established among these islands. Islamic sultanates are established. So mainland Southeast Asia remains strong and independent. It can fend off the advances of first the Muslims and later the Europeans, whereas the islands come under the influence of Islamic traders, eventually Islamic kingdoms. Now, of course, eventually, though, the Europeans are going to show up because it's the age of exploration, drawn to the spices that are there. We learned about that in section 1. There's so much money to be had in the spice trade. People are willing to take a 2-year trip to sell all the way around Africa to Asia to get the spices, to make a lot of money. So, of course, it's in the Europeans' interest to begin to actually take over the islands of Southeast Asia. So, to review, the Muslim traders are there first. As I said, Islam spreads from the Middle East to India, eventually to the islands of Southeast Asia. Right? But then the Europeans are going to start showing up in the late 1400s. Now, see if you can remember from section 1 the first European country to actually show up in large numbers. It was the European country that started the age of exploration because they wanted to see if you could sell around Africa and make it to Asia. Hopefully you remember it. It was the Portuguese, right? Diaz and da Gama. Right? And so the Portuguese began to actually take over some of the islands of Southeast Asia to try to control the spice trade, make even more money, and then eventually that draws the Dutch and the English as well. That's why if you visit the islands of Southeast Asia, you're going to see traces of Portuguese culture and Dutch culture and English culture, and in some of the islands Spanish culture. That's why some of the people in the islands of Southeast Asia, some are Muslim, some are Hindu, some are Buddhist, some are Catholic, some are Protestant. So many people and so many cultures and so many religions have came through Southeast Asia because of the trade, basically, that it's left a very interesting mix of cultures and religions in Southeast Asia. Now, the Dutch, in particular, the Netherlands, the Dutch, they get involved heavily in the spice trade and take over certain islands. Not all of them, right? Because if you're the Dutch, you don't have a huge empire. Right? You want to take over those islands where you can make the most money. And so what the Dutch do is pretty neat. They take over islands where they grow cloves. This is spice you smell a lot during Christmas time. And what the Dutch do is very smart. It's very Machiavellian of them, is they actually decrease the amount of cloves grown on purpose to make more money, which at first seems counterintuitive, seems weird. Seems like you want to grow more to sell more to make more money. And the Dutch are like, no, 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 no. We want to make less to make more money. See, the Dutch figured it out. See, there was a high demand for cloves. Everyone wanted it back home in Europe. And if there's something that everyone wants and there's less of it, it's more valuable because it's less common. So they artificially inflate the price of the of the clove trade. Pretty sneaky. So the islands of Southeast Asia, right? They get conquered by first by the Muslim traders, and then the Portuguese and the Dutch and the English. Eventually, even the Spanish show up and the French show up, and the islands are taken over. Right? But there's very little impact on mainland Southeast Asia, which begs the question why. It's pretty easy when you stop and think about it, right? Mainland Southeast Asia, remember, they had those strong, unified kingdoms. You're not, look, if you're a bully, think of the Europeans like a bully, right? If you're a bully, you don't pick on the big guy, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? You don't try to take the big guy's lunch money. You avoid that. For the Europeans, there's no reason to fight the mainland states. They're too strong. There's no money in it. If you're the English, for instance, and you take over Vietnam during this time period, it's going to be very costly, and what have you gained? Nothing really at this point in history. There's no reason for them to do it, so they leave them alone, right? But they go after the islands, right? Because the islands, well, they're smaller, right? So if you are the Europeans, remember I said think of them like a bully, right? The islands, that's the small kid. That's who you're going to go after. That's whose lunch money you're going to take and shove in the locker. Right? The islands are victimized by their own resources because that's where the spices are grown. There's even a chain of islands called the Spice Islands. So why would you fight, big and strong Thailand or Burma or Vietnam when you could go after these smaller islands that have the product that you want anyway to make money? So, if you think of it, just draw a simple T-chart. Label one column mainland states and the other one islands, and then try to put the following information where it should go, either under mainland column or the island column. You can just hit the pause button while you're working on that. Probably did it pretty easily. You remember the mainland states, they're strong, they're unified, so they're able to keep the Europeans out. Or the islands, they're not as strong, they're not as unified, they're conquered by the Europeans, and they're victims of their own resources, spices. There's no reason to take over the mainland states yet in the 14, 15, 16, even to the 1700s. Now that will change eventually, particularly once we hit the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, and all of a sudden Europe needs more of everything. They need more timber, they need more coal, they need more iron, they need more everything. Then it's going to make sense to go after mainland states because there will be money to be made off of them, and plus at that point the Europeans will be a lot stronger than they are, I'd say, in the 14 and 1500s.